There was an incident that occurred in Matewan, West Virginia, in Mingo County in 1920, May 19th, 1920, that gives us a really good picture of what law enforcement was like in that period of time. A group of private detectives from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency were hired by the Stone Mountain Coal Company. People who work for the Stone Mountain Coal Company were usually paid in company script or company coins, and they lived in company-owned homes, and the only place they could spend the company script was in company stores, and it was really the mine controlled pretty much everything as far as their employees were concerned, and for the most part as far as the community was concerned. And they hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency to enforce their security concerns and whatever else needed to be enforced. So on this particular day, a group of about a dozen, well, actually there were 13 Baldwin Felts detectives led by Albert Felts, which is a brother of the co-owner. They arrived at Matewan to do some evictions. They had about half a dozen homes that they were going to evict, probably former employees of Stone Mountain Coal Company. And so they went about the process of doing that. Now, Albert Felts, in addition to being the leader of this group of Baldwin Felts detectives hired by the mining company, was also a deputy sheriff, because in that day, a sheriff could just simply swear you in as a deputy. He could just simply raise your right hand, he swears you in, you're a deputy sheriff. He may or may not be paid, but he carried the authority of a deputy sheriff, and that was the case with Albert Felts. So he was not just a Baldwin Felts detective, but he was a deputy sheriff, and he had his detectives with him. And after a little while they were conducting these evictions, they had a visit from the chief of police in Matewan, Sid Hatfield, and several townspeople that were with him. And they had words, they had verbal confrontations, and then Felts told them that he did not want any trouble, and he probably didn't, because it seems that he was probably pretty much outnumbered, probably very much at a disadvantage. It doesn't appear that he was expecting any trouble either, because before they left town, they were waiting for the 5 o'clock train. They had supper at a restaurant, and they didn't keep their firearms, their rifles handy while they were eating. They didn't appear to be really expecting trouble. And then they went to the train station to wait for the train to take them back home. Well, while they were at the train station, Chief Hatfield and his mayor, Cable Testerman, and several people, several of their friends, their posse, if you want to call it that, they approached the Baldwin Felts detectives, and after an exchange of words, there was an exchange of gunfire. In fact, there was an exchange of a lot of gunfire. Several hundred rounds were fired. And at the end of this shootout, there were a lot of people dead. Mayor Cable Testerman was one of the dead, and also two others that were aligned with Chief Hatfield had died. Albert Felts, the deputy sheriff, was dead, as was his brother Lee Felts, and an additional 5 Baldwin Felts detectives were dead. This was less than a year after the state police had been formed, but of course in that period of time they had not had a chance to become well established. And so the law at that time consisted of a few law enforcement officers, very often posses that they would put together. And here we have actually a city police chief having a shootout with his group against a deputy sheriff and his group. The deputy sheriff being sort of a secondary interest, I think, to Albert Felts, whose first loyalty probably was to his brother's company that he worked for. So the story doesn't end there, as most shootings doesn't end with the shooting. 16 people were indicted for the murders that took place, or the killings, I should say, that took place. And none of the 16 were convicted. So this did cost, or circumstances surrounding this cost the chief of police his job. So Sid Hatfield loses his job there, and he very quickly becomes elected as a constable, and was involved in a shooting as a constable that found him standing trial in McDowell County, neighboring McDowell County, West Virginia. He's on trial for shooting someone in that county, and while they had taken their lunch break and returning from it, walking up the steps of the courthouse, Sid Hatfield was shot dead by members of the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency. None of them were ever charged with it. So that kind of brought to a close that chapter. It led to further violence in other ways, but sort of as a side note to the violence, we'll back up to the day that the shootout happened at Matewan. Mary Cable Testerman was killed that day, and his widow, Jessie, 2 weeks later, married Sid Hatfield. And they were married when he was shot down in McDowell County. When he was shot down in McDowell County, finding herself single again, she married a state trooper, Private Sylvester Petrie, and he was immediately fired for marrying her, because at that time, the state police did not allow their troopers to get married without permission, and they were not going to give their troopers permission to marry someone who had kind of a controversial past.